I first saw the original Blade Runner in a college class called Philosophy and Science Fiction. Yeah, that was an actual class that I paid a lot of money to take.
$120,000!
And I think that may help contextualize my affection for the movie. Sure, I loved the groundbreaking genre blend of futuristic sci-fi and hard-boiled detective noir, and I love that the incredible production design and unique aesthetic has a solid foot in both genres, but what really drew me in was the philosophical elements of the story. Blade Runner 2049 is one of those sequels where it's not entirely necessary to have seen the original, but it makes for a much, much richer experience. So, for the sake of a deeper discussion of 2049, we first need in 2019 Los Angeles, or 37 years in the future when the movie came out, there are these things called replicants. Basically, man-made, bioengineered, human-like androids designed for slave labor as we colonize other planets, but also more or less indistinguishable from humans, only found to be replicants when they take a Voight comp test to see if they have authentic emotional responses to stuff.
The tortoise lays on its back, its belly baking in the hot sun, beating its legs, trying to turn itself over, but it can't. Not without your help. But you're not helping.
What do you mean I'm not helping?
I mean you're not helping. Why is that, Leon?
This is an important detail. What separates humans from replicants, externally at least, is authentic emotional response. This is what I mean when I say I was drawn to the philosophical elements of the story. The existence of replicants and the distinction between replicants and humans invites us to consider what it really means to be human. And the short answer, in the Blade Runner universe, is authentic emotional response. In a word, empathy. Harrison Ford plays Rick Deckard, a Blade Runner.
He say you Blade Runner.
Tell him I'm eating.
A Blade Runner's job is to track down and retire replicants. Even though the Nexus 6 replicant models have a built-in 4-year lifespan, so they don't live long enough to develop authentic emotional responses, sometimes they go rogue and need to be retired, which is the plot of the 1982 movie. Deckard has to track down and kill 4 Nexus 6 model replicants: Leon, Zora, Pris, and Roy Batty. Also, Deckard falls in love with a replicant named Rachel, who uniquely doesn't know she's a replicant because she was built with childhood memories implanted in her, memories she initially believes are her own lived experience until Deckard tells her otherwise.
Those aren't your memories, they're somebody else's. They're Tyrell's nieces.
For this reason, she damn near passes the Voight comp test, because having memories of lived experience makes her emotional responses more authentic. In the climax of the movie, Roy Batty hunts an injured Deckard to the roof of a building. Deckard dangles from the edge, about to fall, and surprisingly, Roy saves him. Then he gives one of the most iconic speeches in movie history, lamenting that the things he's seen, the experiences he's had in his 4 years of life, will be lost forever once he's gone.
All those moments will be lost in time. Like tears in rain.
Then, having reached the end of his 4-year lifespan, he dies. And the dove that he randomly just found, I guess, flies away, evoking a soul leaving his body.
It's a metaphor.
As the movie ends, Deckard takes Rachel away and they go on the run together. Her would-be limited lifespan be damned. And depending on which of the many versions of the movie you watch, there are some subtle or overt suggestions that maybe Deckard himself is also a replicant without knowing it, not unlike how Rachel didn't know that she was a replicant. But the Deckard as replicant question is left intentionally ambiguous and has been a source of much debate for decades. I had always planned to do a video on the original Blade Runner, but now that we have 2049, I'm actually glad I never did, because what 2049 made me realize is that I don't actually love the original Blade Runner. I mostly just love Roy Batty's Tears in Rain speech. Like I said, I definitely appreciate the genre blend and the production design and the aesthetic, but I mostly like the philosophical elements of the Blade Runner world more than I like the actual movie. And all that stuff is still present in 2049, with what I think is a much better movie surrounding it. The original has some pacing problems. I think it feels longer than 2049 despite actually being 45 minutes shorter, and some of the stuff in the original really hasn't aged well. Most notably this yikes scene where Rachel tries to leave, Deckard stops her, and instead insists she kiss him. Romantic? And honestly, Deckard as a protagonist is fairly dull. He's just kind of a stock genre character, and there's not a lot to him. Admittedly, I'm not sure if this is a feature or a bug, but the supposed villains are more interesting and more sympathetic than the protagonist. And to the movie's credit, the big picture arc is Deckard coming to that realization. While the replicants are at first depicted as homicidal psychopaths, they're ultimately shown to be sympathetic and more human than we or Deckard might have initially given them credit for. In a key scene, Roy Batty visits Tyrell, the owner of the corporation that makes replicants. He demands that Tyrell give him more life beyond his 4 years, and then kills him when he won't. While the violent response isn't great, what could be more human than this wrestling with mortality? This mortal desire for more time on Earth. And the introduction of the possibility of Deckard himself being a replicant only sharpens this arc. The movie spends its 117-minute runtime convincing the audience to feel empathy for replicants, only to suggest in the final moments that our main character may also be one. And I have to admit, the question of whether or not Deckard is a replicant is also something that's really drawn me to the movie over the years. Big surprise, a reason to overanalyze and pull apart every detail of a movie appealed to me. I just loved putting the puzzle pieces together to come to a conclusion about Deckard's replicant status. And then, after moviegoers debated for 35 years, Blade Runner 2049 comes along and says, it doesn't matter. When I say that Blade Runner 2049 made me realize that I don't actually love Blade Runner, it's only because I really love 2049. And not just the world and the aesthetic and the philosophical quandaries, but kind of everything about it. I love the pieces of it: screenplay, production design, cinematography, acting, and I love it as a whole. I love how it fits into and deepens the Blade Runner mythology, and I love it as a standalone piece of blockbuster filmmaking. Like, I don't mean to be hyperbolic, but this has got to be one of the most artful, big-budget movies I've maybe ever seen. Not to speak ill of today's blockbusters, but you just don't see many movies of this scale with this level of artistry, this level of craft. In the original Blade Runner, the late production designer Lawrence Paul famously used miniatures to create a dazzling and dark Los Angeles of the future. And even though most big-budget sci-fi movies nowadays lean heavily on CGI for their production design, 2049 production designer Dennis Gassner took a page from his predecessor and integrated complex miniatures to build the world of the movie. Sure, CGI has come a long way, and computer-generated backdrops can be great, but even so, there's something tactile about shooting a physical object in camera. This world just feels real and lived in. Speaking of lived in, the idea that in the next 30 years, the beautiful expansive stretch of I-5 between LA and San Diego will be reduced to a literal dumping ground for LA's trash is both depressing and, I don't know, maybe a little too plausible.
It was sad.
I think it's refreshing to see this much care and precision in a huge budget blockbuster. But to be fair, not many huge budget blockbusters are directed by Denis Villeneuve. The thing I love most about his movies is that they're all clearly very carefully made. By all accounts, he's a rigorous planner, and it shows. Every moment of his movies seems very well thought out. I see interesting storytelling decisions everywhere. Small example, here's the opening shot of Arrival. The camera dollies forward and tilts down along a ceiling with straight lines, and we hear the opening narration.
I used to think this was the beginning of your story.
Then there's a 2-minute montage where Amy Adams is speaking to her daughter about how we perceive time.
We are so bound by time, by its order.
At the end of this montage, her narration concludes, and then there's a similar dolly forward, but this time with a curved hallway, contrasting the straight lines on the ceiling at the start of the montage. Not to spoil anything about Arrival's twists and turns, but there's certainly some visual storytelling happening here with these contrasting images bookending the prologue, particularly when you juxtapose it with narration about our perception of how time works. All to say, Villeneuve strikes me as a very thoughtful director who gives every storytelling decision due consideration. I think this comes through with each story movement, each shot, and even each cut. Let's really dig into the nitty-gritty of the opening sequence of 2049, and let's see what kind of storytelling decisions we can glean. We open with Kay Spinner flying over farmland, giving us our first look at Dennis Gassner's incredible production design. As I said, the miniatures make the world feel tactile. It doesn't look like cheap CGI because it's not. This feels real because it is. I also love that when we open on Kay, he's literally asleep at the wheel. I'll get to this later, but part of his arc is an awakening of sorts. So the fact that he starts the movie literally asleep is just a Fun detail. Cut to a guy we later learned to be Sapper Morton digging nematodes out of a bucket. Note how the red of his glove really pops in the center of the frame, and how the yellow entrance of his house really pops too. Villeneuve has said in interviews that all of the colors in this movie mean something, and in particular, every time yellow appears, it means something. He hasn't divulged what it means, just that its use is intentional. And there have been plenty of articles and blog posts written in the last few years theorizing about what each color might mean. Read those at your leisure. But here's my half-baked theory. Seems like yellow comes up a lot whenever Kay is moving towards the truth. Like yellow breadcrumb showing him the way to solve this mystery. Sapper's house, the flower where Rachel is buried, this guy in a yellow shirt at the nursing home where Kay interviews Gaff. I also noticed that red seems to be worn by people standing in his way from solving the mystery. Sapper, Mr. Cotton, Love. So if yellow leads him towards the solution, and red is roadblocks to the solution, yellow and red together make orange. Which kind of makes sense because Deckard is kind of simultaneously the solution to the mystery, but also the final immovable roadblock to the truth. He's the one person who knows about the replicant child, but he also can't tell you anything about it. I don't know. It's a theory. Probably wrong. Anywho, back to this opening scene. As Sapper Morton enters his house, both he and Kay are illuminated by the only two windows, creating a cool silhouette effect on Kay in particular, visually indicating a mystery about his character by shrouding him in shadow, a motif that we'll see again as Kay digs into his own past. When Kay identifies Sapper by a number...
Are you Sapper Morton? Civic number NK68514.
Sapper counters, "I'm a farmer," insisting on defining himself on his own terms, in human terms, instead of as a number. Their conversation is pleasant enough. Kay asks about his farm, Sapper offers him garlic, but the conversation takes a turn when Kay says this.
I prefer to keep an empty stomach until the hard part of the day is done.
This marks a subtle change in the tone of the conversation, as Kay confirms that this isn't just a friendly visit. And so, of course, once he says this, we immediately cut to a boiling pot, visually indicating this increased tension. And Kay asks,
"How long you been here?"
with just a slight uptick of menace in his voice. This scene is barreling towards a physical conflict. If that wasn't clear from Sapper's standoffishness, as he physically looms over Kay, it's definitely clear now. And that's exactly where it goes. Two quick things about their fight. Number one, their fight is a good reiteration of what we learned in the opening text, that replicants have superhuman strength. And number two, Morton stabbing Kay is a cool reveal that Kay is also a replicant, something we didn't know before this moment. Nor did Sapper. That's why he says,
How's it feel? Killing your own kind.
to which Kay crucially responds,
I don't retire my own kind because we don't run. Only older models do.
This is Kay attempting to separate himself from Sapper. He notably empathized with Sapper moments ago,
Must have been brutal.
but now says, no, I'm different from you. And that's why it's okay for me to... The fact that Kay so adamantly separates himself from Sapper is a precursor to what his boss, Lieutenant Joshi, says 20 minutes later, which, spoiler alert, happens to be one of the most important lines in the movie.
The world is built on a wall that separates kind. Tell either side there's no wall, you bought a war. Or a slaughter.
But let's not get ahead of ourselves. One last thing about this opening scene, it ends with a patented Roger Deakins overhead hand-washing shot, which he also did after the violent opening scene of No Country for Old Men. And I only bring this up to segue into Roger Deakins' cinematography in this movie. He won his first Oscar on his 14th nomination for this, and it's easy to see why. Every damn frame of this movie is gorgeous and should be in a goddamn art gallery. Here's just a smattering of some of my favorite shots. And as long as I'm talking about craft, production design, editing, cinematography, I'll mention the acting. I think it's really remarkable how much the characters are constructed in such a way that the performer can really lean into his or her prowess. Early in his career, Ryan Gosling cut his teeth on playing emotionally subdued characters, from The United States of Leland to his first Oscar nomination in Half Nelson, even The Notebook for the most part, all culminating in his super minimalist work with Nicholas Winding Refn. He's good at playing tempered, subdued characters who emote in small, subtle ways or not at all. So how appropriate that his character in 2049 must keep his emotions subdued, or tempered, or non-existent. Because if he shows too much emotion in his baseline tests, he's retired. All of which makes this moment, where he finally lets it all out, all the more meaningful. All due respect to Harrison Ford, but he's really leaned heavy into the gruff, crotchety guy who's kind of over it all for the last, 2 decades, both on and off screen.
Or did Greedo shoot you first?
I don't care.
So how appropriate that his character in 2049 is a gruff, crotchety guy who's kind of over it all and just wants to be left alone. I don't want to speak ill of Jared Leto. I personally think he's a fine actor and he's made some great movies, but he does have a reputation as being a bit of a douche who thinks very highly of himself. So, given that reputation, whether it's true or not, how appropriate that his character in 2049 is a megalomaniac who seems to think he's the smartest, most important person in the universe, and who loves the sound of his own voice and can chew the fuck out of the scenery. Can't say I've seen Sylvia Hooks in anything other than 2049, but holy shit, she steals every scene she's in. And not just because she's one of the scariest, most unstoppable villains this side of the Terminator franchise, but also for how heartbreaking her performance is in scenes with Neander Wallace. How desperate she is for his approval. I think the performances are great across the board. Just my 2 cents on the acting. As I've said many times on this channel, I don't know a ton about cinematography or editing, and I know next to nothing about acting or production, so let me move on to some stuff that I feel at least a little qualified to talk about. I love the screenplay for 2049. Absolutely love it. And I don't just mean that I love the plot, characters, and theme, though I love those too, and I'll get to those, but I also mean that I love the screenplay itself. Like reading what Michael Green and Hampton Fancher wrote. Seriously, Google Blade Runner 2049 screenplay PDF and give it a shot. It's a great read, and it enriches the experience of the movie. Here are a few of my favorite flourishes. The very first lines describing the farmland we're flying over.
Called farm only generously, the ground dry, inhospitable. A dubious horizon to distinguish the browns that are both earth and sky. There is no green in sight. Descriptive, efficient, and it's even setting up some thematic stuff, emphasizing how it's paradoxically a farm that's inhospitable to growing anything, to producing life. And yet we later learn that a replicant gave birth here, created life here, as unlikely as that may seem. Similarly, there's a line of dialogue in Kay's interaction with Sapper that didn't make it into the finished film. Sapper says, of the nematodes he grows, it only takes one. Then when Kay returns to the farm to investigate the tree, he's reminded of this line. This is also clear foreshadowing of how this one replicant birth can ultimately start a revolution. It only takes one. Another thing I love is Love's character introduction. Love, polite, efficient, perfect. Moral as a tornado and about as safe. Beautiful, yes, the way a sword can be if it's safely behind glass. I hope whoever wrote that line just patted themselves on the back and then took the rest of the day off. Both in the script and in the movie, Kay points out how notable it is that Love has a name.
He named you. Must be special.
However, in the script, but not in the movie, it's explicitly stated that Love isn't actually named. It's a diminutive pet name that Wallace uses for everyone that she latches onto in order to feel special. I think this is super revealing about Love's character, that what she wants above anything else is approval and affection from Neander Wallace. As the scene direction says a few lines later, beyond respect, she lives in perpetual awe of him. Another great moment in the script is the wooden horse reveal. There's no dialogue in the scene, so on the page, the moment plays out entirely in scene description. If you've never read a screenplay before, the purpose of scene description is just to describe what happens, literally what we see on screen. And what happens in this scene is simple. Kay approaches the furnace, reaches inside, and pulls out the horse. But this moment is more than those simple actions. It's unbelievably loaded and meaningful. And the enormity of this moment comes across on the page beautifully. while still being economical and utilitarian. It's just great screenwriting. Similarly, this description of Vegas is pretty awesome. Maybe it's a little bit too prosy and flowery for a screenplay, but it's awesome, so I'll allow it. There's another moment in the script that doesn't make the final cut of the movie when Kay goes to see Dr. Anna. In the movie, she just checks whether his horse memory is real, but in the script, she first checks a different memory, which she tells him is fake. In the fake memory, Kay nearly drowns as a teenager, and Dr. Anna says the memory is clearly fake because its moral message is too clear. Stay away from the water. I think it's interesting that Kay has an implanted memory designed to make him afraid of water, and he ends up having to fight for his life in water to save Deckard later in the movie. And while that's kind of interesting, I also think it was the right call to ultimately cut it from the movie. When Kay goes to save Deckard at the end, we at first don't actually know if he's going to save Deckard or kill Deckard.
You must kill Deckard.
So there's already quite a bit going on with Kay's actions here. Adding in Kay being afraid of the water just kind of feels like an afterthought. The sequence is already dramatic enough. And last but not least, I love how the script and the movie handle the question of whether or not Deckard is a replicant. In the movie, Wallace rhetorically asked Deckard if it ever occurred to him that maybe he was designed to fall for Rachel.
Did it never occur to you that's why you were summoned in the first place? Designed to do nothing short of fall for her right then and there.
Seeming to finally confirm after decades that, yes, Deckard is a replicant, a designed being. But after a pregnant pause, Wallace continues,
that is, if you were designed.
Keeping the question ambiguous after all these years. Yes, that ambiguousness is there in the movie, but it's underlined in the script, and I really enjoy that. But okay, while that's all well and good and make for a fun read, those flourishes don't necessarily make a better movie, and that's what we're talking about here. So let's talk about what actually makes it to the screen. I seek out negative reviews of movies I love to see if I'm overlooking something or if I'm being overly effusive or whatever. And the biggest complaint I see among the negative reviews for Blade Runner 2049 is its length and pacing. As far as length, yeah, 2 hours and 43 minutes is nothing to sneeze at, but to quote Roger Ebert, no good movie is too long. The Dark Knight is really long, but it's really good, so you don't care. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is really long, but it's really good, so you don't care. I wish that movie were longer. So criticizing a movie for its runtime is a little strange to me, but I get the criticism behind the criticism, which is pacing. And the reason a movie has pacing problems more or less boils down to there are stretches where it's boring. And listen, if something bores you, I'm not sure there's anything I can say to convince you it's not boring. Finding interest in something is all relative and subjective. But for me, the plot of 2049 moves like a dream. I'm into it from moment one, and I'm in for 160 minutes. Every story beat leads smoothly into the next, and I'm always invested in where the story's going. I'll get into character and theme, but for now, let me just take a few minutes to summarize the plot of 2049 just to illustrate how well I think the story flows. And along the way, I'll point out the act breaks and a few other screenwriter lingo story milestones because, if nothing else, I think that's helpful when assessing the pacing of something. So, the plot of Blade Runner 2049. During a routine retirement of a Nexus 8 replicant, Kay finds something buried under a tree. It turns out, bones. This is effectively our inciting incident because it's the disruption of the routine that sets the story in motion. Kay goes home and gives Joy, his hologram girlfriend, an emanator as a present. He's called in by Lieutenant Joshi about his dig. While examining the bones, they find that they belong to a woman who died in childbirth, a replicant who died in childbirth. Joshi orders Kay to destroy all evidence of this happening, including and especially finding the kid. This is the start of Act 2 because it begins the main thrust of the story, which is Kay's investigation into this replicant child. Kay goes to the Walls Corporation to investigate the serial number on the bones. Here we meet Love and learn that the replicant who gave birth was Rachel from the original movie. A sex worker named Marriott points out how strange it is that there was a tree at Sapper's farm. She's never seen a tree before. This makes Kay realize, yeah, it's actually super weird that there's a tree there, so he goes back to the farm to investigate further. There, he finds a date carved into the base of the tree where Rachel was buried. 6/10/21. Kay is stunned by this date for reasons we don't yet understand. Meanwhile, Love goes to see her boss, Neander Wallace, who already knows about the replicant child and is trying to develop more replicants capable of giving birth so that they can have more slave labor.
We need more replicants than can ever be assembled. Millions so we can be trillions more.
He tasks Love with finding the child, just as Joshi tasked Kay with the same. Kay shares with Joshi an implanted memory he has. He was in an orphanage and was chased by a group of boys who wanted his wooden horse. He threw it in a furnace to keep them from getting it, and they beat him up for it. Joy then reveals that Kay left out a key piece of information in this memory, that 6/10/21 was carved on the bottom of the horse, the same date carved in the tree where Rachel was buried. This is the first indication that Kay is the born replicant child that he's looking for, but he writes this off as a dangerous coincidence. For now. Kay tracks down the orphanage where the replicant child had been hidden. There, he finds an entire year of records is missing, a dead end in his investigation. But then, Kay finds the furnace from his supposedly implanted memory with the wooden horse still inside, intact, confirming that his memory is real, and holy shit, he is the replicant-born child. In a lot of screenplays, there's a major reversal of some sort at the midpoint. In 2049, where the narrative thrust is Kay searching for this child, him learning that he is the child certainly qualifies as a major narrative reversal. So this is functionally the midpoint of the narrative. And it also happens to take place at almost the exact midpoint of the movie's runtime, if you don't count the end credits, and at almost the exact midpoint of the screenplay, which I personally just find super satisfying. Just to be absolutely sure, Kay goes to see the person who makes replicant memories, Dr. Anna Stelling. She confirms his horse memory is real. Kay is the child. He goes home to tell Joy what he's learned, and she has a surprise waiting for him, the sex worker Marriott. They have a visually dazzling threesome of sorts. An analysis of the wood from the horse leads Kay to a place of nuclear volatility, Las Vegas. There he finds Rick Deckard living in hiding. Deckard explains that he disappeared because that was part of the plan. If he'd been around, people might have been able to use him to find his child.
Because we were being hunted. I didn't want our child found, taken apart, dissected.
Now we come to the end of Act 2, where Love and her cronies show up in Vegas, take Deckard, and are about to kill Kay, but Joy begs Love to stop. So instead, she smashes Joy's emanator, effectively killing Joy and leaving Kay bruised, broken, and alone. Kay is rescued by a group of people whose faces we can't see, and it turns out one of them is Marriott. She works to heal his injuries. Deckard is brought before Wallace. He offers Deckard a new version of Rachel in exchange for information about his child, but Deckard turns him down.
Her eyes were green.
Wallace says they have ways of making him talk off-world. Marriott brings Kay before Freyza, a leader of underground replicant revolutionaries. She reveals that she was present for the birth of the replicant child, and it was a girl. Kay is wrong about being the replicant child. Dr. Anna Stelling, the one who makes the memories, she is the child. Freyza tells Kay that he must now go kill Deckard so that Neander Wallace can't get any information out of him to jeopardize Dr. Anna or Freyza and the revolutionaries. Having now lost everything, his one companion in life, his job, and now his soul, Kay looks at an advertisement for Joy's and contemplates the meaninglessness of everything he ever thought was real. And he makes a decision. Kay attacks the transport taking Love and Deckard off-world, kills Love, and saves Deckard, getting mortally wounded in the process. He then takes Deckard to meet his daughter, and then dies. So, I understand that some people find parts of this movie boring, but for me, this plot moves beautifully. It's clean, it's coherent, one thing leads nicely to the next thing, there's a running mystery at the center of the narrative, and the mystery evolves, and I'm always engaged and always curious about what's going to happen next. And importantly, the stakes are always clear, and it's so impressive how the stakes build. We begin with Kay's normal life, or the ordinary world in the parlance of Screenwriting 101, which comes with its fair share of stakes, namely Kay's mortal peril just being part of the job. But then he discovers something that threatens the world. But the world that Kay is sort of separate from, outside of. The discovery of the replicant child is certainly an escalation of stakes in the sense that societal hierarchy is threatened and therefore it could bring about a war or a slaughter. But it's more a threat to humanity's asserted dominance over replicants than a direct threat to our protagonist. More on that later. But then an even bigger escalation of stakes when Kay discovers that he is the replicant child, and suddenly Kay's existence is threatened, as the LAPD is looking to eliminate him and keep his existence a secret, and Neander Wallace is looking for him so he can be taken apart and studied. And then further escalation of stakes as Kay is nearly killed, and everything he's ever loved is taken from him, and then, as a cherry on top, his soul is killed when he learns he's not, in fact, the child. But okay, as long as I'm talking about how some people find this movie boring, I guess I can't not talk about that midpoint climax. So let's dig into it. Minutes before he goes to the furnace, Kay passes by the corridor and pauses with a look of recognition. We don't yet know why exactly he's pausing, but it's not hard to guess. Then he hits a dead end in his investigation. Paige is missing from the orphanage records, his lead's exhausted, no more clues to follow. But then, Kay notes that the ashtray is a horse head. That makes him think, I gotta go check that f***ing furnace. Then he slowly approaches. He takes his sweet-ass time walking through all this machinery, and then finally, he reaches the furnace, slowly reaches in and pulls out something wrapped in cloth, and slowly unwraps it, and it's, of course, the horse from his memory. From the moment Kay hits a dead end in his search of the orphanage records to the end of this scene after he finds the horse in the furnace, story-wise, the only thing that really happens is Kay finds the wooden horse from his memory. But this one story beat takes 4.5 minutes. Villeneuve and editor Joe Walker are certainly unhurried here, but in defense of this scene, there has to be build-up because this moment needs to land. This is a holy shit reveal. The replicant child, which changes everything about the hierarchy upon which society is based, which will completely upend the social order, which Kay is tasked with finding in order to preserve that social order, is Kay. I don't know, maybe this could have been 2 minutes instead of 4.5. Fine. I just think this reveal deserves the build-up because this is the key moment of the movie so far, where Kay learns that even though he's a replicant, he's born and not made. Almost like he's halfway human.
A child of woman born, pushed into the world, wanted, loved.
Screenwriter Hampton Fancher wrote the original Blade Runner, and he also wrote the treatment and first draft of 2049. And he had this to say about Kay. The image I had in my head of Kay was that this guy is a handbook. He follows the rules. He's a machine in a way. But the image was this. A handbook turns into a poem through his experiences and his ordeal in love. And this holy shit moment in the middle of the movie is when Kay the handbook begins to really transform into Kay the poem, when he begins to question all those rules he's always followed and begins to believe there's something special about him. Not to spoil the end of this video, but the overall thematic arc of Blade Runner 2049 is about empathy and love. So I think going from a handbook to a poem, to use Hampton Fancher's words, makes him a perfect protagonist to experience that thematic arc. And I also think he's the perfect protagonist for the genre he's in. Like I said, the discovery of the replicant child threatens the world, but not necessarily Kay's world. The discovery is more dangerous for humans because it threatens humanity's dominance of replicants. But it's still a threat to Kay because he's complicit in that dominance. He's not a human, but as a Blade Runner, he defends the societal structures put in place by humans to protect humans from replicants, despite being a replicant himself. In the most classic film noir sense, he is... I already mentioned that one of the most interesting things about the OG Blade Runner was its meld of the science fiction and neo-noir detective genres, where you have the archetypical grizzled loner PI type dude in a trench coat tracking down clues in order to locate robots in this case. So while it's set in the future and in a world steeped in science fiction ephemera, from flying cars to holograms to robots to whatever this is, the plot mechanics are pretty much all detective story. 2049 is kind of the same way. It's a detective story with a science fiction setting, basically. Despite the backdrop of androids and holograms and flying cars and a dystopian future, the actual story beats are based around Kay investigating a mystery and slowly solving the case. So let's talk about Kay as an archetypical hard-boiled detective character. Thomas Schatz describes the hard-boiled detective hero as a cultural middleman, a social mediator, a cultural go-between, existing on the line between law and lawlessness, between society and criminality, bridging the gap between the two, but not quite belonging to either. He's a loner, outside of society, but he works to maintain order in that society by investigating criminals and bringing them to justice. Kay follows this to a T in fascinating ways. As a replicant, he doesn't really belong to the society of mankind. He's an ostracized outsider. And yet, as a Blade Runner, he works to keep order in mankind's society. So, as Sapper Morton says,
how does it feel killing your own kind?
Kay doesn't exactly belong with replicants either, because he retires his own kind. The wall that separates kind that Joshi warns about, that's the wall where Kay stands, as a cultural middleman, as a social mediator, as a cultural go-between. Not necessarily between cop and criminal, but between human and replicant. So how fucking fascinating that he, for a time, thinks he's a born replicant, which puts him even more into that middle ground between the sides of this wall separating kind. Okay, so that's all well and good. I think Blade Runner 2049 is top-notch filmmaking craft with interesting creative choices, all in service of a compelling detective story that's never boring. That's all you can really ask for in a movie, right? Well, let's dig a little deeper.
And for me, the movies are like a machine that generates empathy. If it's a great movie, it lets you understand a little bit more about what it's like to be a different gender, a different race, a different age, a different economic class, a different nationality, different profession, different hopes, aspirations, dreams, and fears. It helps us to identify with the people who are sharing this journey with us.
The first time I saw Blade Runner 2049, I couldn't stop thinking about this line.
The world is built on a wall that separates kind. Tell either side there's no wall, you bought a war. Or a slaughter.
This is an incredibly loaded statement. First admitting that society's stability depends on the continued distinction of human and replicant, and then immediately conceding that such a distinction is tenuous. With the discovery that replicants may also be able to reproduce, the distinction is even more tenuous. There's a lot to unpack here, but let's start with the immediate stuff. Let's say there's a wall that separates kind. Why would replicant reproduction mean that there's no wall? Kay says that to be born is to have a soul.
I've never retired something that was born before.
What's the difference?
To be born is to have a soul, I guess.
And I think that what he's really saying is that to be born involves some sort of natural creation of life, as in life created by nature and not by man. The implication that Kay dances around but never actually says, because replicants are created by man, it's permissible for them to be controlled and, if needed, killed by man, or by a proxy for man in the case of Kay. But a replicant born is somehow outside the jurisdiction of man. And let's dig even deeper. What distinguishes humans and replicants? It's authentic emotional response. A person's emotional response is a result of their collective lived experience, and a replicant's emotional response is a result of manufactured implanted memories. One is ostensibly more authentic than the other, and the Voight-Kampff test can weed out which is which. But if a replicant was born, well, you can see the problem. This born replicant doesn't have an emotional cortex formed by manufactured implanted memories. It's instead informed by a life lived, just as is the case for a human. A born replicant would theoretically pass a Voight-Kampff test because their emotions would be just as authentic as a human's.
It feels authentic, and if you have authentic memories, you have real human responses. Wouldn't you agree?
And therein lies the problem with that wall that separates kind. If this born replicant's emotional response is just as authentic as a human's, then what's separating replicant and human? Nothing. Without this degree of artificiality in a replicant's emotional cortex, what's stopping us as humans from fully empathizing with replicants? Nothing. Like I said at the top, the narrative arc of the original Blade Runner is learning to empathize with replicants, and 2049 takes that a step further. Basically, if you weren't already convinced that replicants were deserving of your empathy, this replicant birth thing sort of forces you to logic your way into empathizing with them. But on top of that, 2049 is doing something else. By taking empathy for replicants as a starting point, the movie pushes on our limits for who or what we're capable of empathizing with. Let's talk about Joy. Joy is Kay's hologram girlfriend played by Ana de Armas. She's at first tethered to a projector on a mechanical arm, but then she's free to roam outside the apartment due to an emanator that Kay gives her in her first scene. She's easily the most important relationship in Kay's life. Basically, his only relationship. She pops up periodically throughout the movie, usually just to debrief with Kay and give us, the audience, a chance to hear Kay vocalize his thought process in his investigation.
It's impossible. Two people can't have identical DNA. One of these isn't real. It's a copy.
And, setting aside an awful lot of complicated things about the technological commodification of female companionship and agency, Joy does seem to definitely have an individual personality, even though she's a program, basically. She expresses joy and gratitude when Kay gives her the emanator. She's happy to be free, untethered, and her first thought is to explore. She reacts with slight jealousy when Joshi comes on to Kay.
You don't prefer your madam?
You were listening?
Maybe.
She expresses awe when she travels for the first time, and real concern for Kay after his spinner crashes and the scavengers approach. She knows how big of a deal it is when Kay thinks that he's the hidden child. She empathizes with him, and she expresses desires of her own.
I want to be real for you.
You are real for me.
And even expresses something like defiant pride at the risk of deleting herself from the mainframe.
If anything happens to this, that's it. You're gone.
Yes. Like a real girl.
Down to the moment that she begs for Kay's life, and in doing so, kinda gives her own, if you can call it that. This moment hurts, and that's the point I'm making. The movie makes us feel an emotional connection with Joy. We feel her death because we recognize her as an emotional entity, someone who feels joy, jealousy, empathy, desire, pride, and loss, and thus we can empathize with her. Maybe not as much as we do with Kay, but more than I ever thought I could with a hologram program, which kind of gets to the heart of what I find so fascinating about the Blade Runner universe. Both movies are instructive on emotionally identifying with beings that you do not expect to be able to emotionally identify with. And I find that rather beautiful. Coming back to Joshi's statement, that wall that separates kind. The wall is there so humans can be comforted by the division, by the hierarchy, by the reassurance that humans are on a higher plane than our creations, and therefore it's admissible for us to dominate, control, and kill our creations. But once we have empathy for replicants, or even empathy for a hologram, once we're emotionally affected by hologram's quote-unquote death, that jeopardizes the presence of the wall. It jeopardizes the hierarchy. It makes us question, wait, why is it okay that we're enslaving and killing these beings? And that brings us to the second part of Joshi's thesis statement. Tell either side of the wall that there's no wall, you've bought a war.
Or a slaughter.
What happens if the wall separating kind disappears? What happens when people begin to question the hierarchy of society and their place in it? Why does this break the world?
This breaks the world, Kay.
You let one ant stand up to us, then they all might stand up. Those puny little ants outnumber us 100 to 1. And if they ever figure that out, there goes our way of life. It's not about food. It's about keeping those ants in line.
Like many sci-fi dystopian stories, from Mad Max Fury Road to Snowpiercer to The Hunger Games to the new Planet of the Apes trilogy, this is a movie about oppression. Yes, it's a detective story. Yes, it's a movie about the distinction between humans and robots, but the core of the Blade Runner universe is a story about oppression and oppressed groups. Replicants are under the thumb of humanity because they need humans in order to exist. They're manufactured by humans, they wouldn't exist without humans. Therefore, there is an implicit subservience to humans. But if and when replicants learn that they can reproduce, that they don't need humans in order to exist, survive, and flourish, well...
You bought a war. Or a slaughter.
Once the oppressed learn that they don't have to take this, they rise up. And we'll get a war for replicant rights, basically.
That baby meant we are more than just slaves. If a baby can come from one of us, we are our own masters.
More human than humans.
So, the surface level reading of the oppression narrative clearly positions replicants as the oppressed group. And they certainly are, but I think there's a bit more to it than that. Returning to Joy, here's a question. Why is Joy female? Or maybe she's not female because she's a computer program, but to use the parlance of the gender binary, Joy presents female. So, why? In Lindsay Ellis's video on feminist theory in the Transformers movies, she laments the lack of female-presenting Transformers, especially given that the Transformers weirdly aren't genderless. They all present male, with their deep voices and barrel chests and he-him pronouns. And so she rhetorically asks, wouldn't it be more interesting to explore a robot society that exists outside the confines of gender? Or that explores the purpose of gender in a species that doesn't reproduce sexually? Applying this question to not only Joy, but to the entire Blade Runner universe, what's the purpose of giving replicants a gender presentation? I don't mean for the screenwriters of Blade Runner, but what is the in-universe rationale for the Tyrell Corporation in the first movie and the Walls Corporation in 2049 to give their products secondary sexual characteristics? A reminder, replicants' original purpose was slave labor. I think it's telling about humanity's desire for connection that instead of creating vaguely anthropomorphic laborers, they created humans, basically. But that leads to the depressingly obvious answer why replicants are given secondary sex characteristics. So they can be used as glorified sex dolls, particularly the female ones. Joy is programmed as female to make her a better companion to men, or male-presenting replicants in the case of K. In our world, we use terms like second-class citizens to describe oppressed groups, and in the hierarchy of the 2049 world, there are second and third-class life forms. Holograms serve replicants, and replicants serve humans. Plenty has been written about both Blade Runner and Blade Runner 2049, and how they aim to be about oppression, but they choose to focus on fictionally oppressed groups, replicants, and fail to depict actually oppressed groups. For example, both movies have pretty glaring blind spots on race. And there's an awful lot of writing on how 2049 handles gender. And I encourage you to seek out that writing, but real quick, I want to highlight something Brian Formo wrote in Collider. Female replicants are built to be the most human, not just for sexual reasons, but also for emotional adulation. He refers to the scene where Love is filling a replicant order for a client and recommends the male labor models not be given too many human characteristics, but they should add some pleasure models to give the male labor models more authentic human companionship. The reason why women replicants are the most complex is because their intimate traits create desire, but the same traits that make one desirable are the same traits that make them dangerous. To have more feelings means to have more sense of justice, more attachment to memories, more psychology. In other words, because female replicants are designed for a different purpose, a companionship purpose, an emotional connection purpose, it makes them more empathetic, more human, and therefore more dangerous. It's not an accident that the underground group of replicant revolutionaries who secretly rally around the replicant child are a group of women. I think that the subtext of 2049's oppression narrative is not just the liberation of replicants, but the liberation of women. The scene where Neander Wallace inspects a newborn replicant is a gruesome encapsulation of how female replicants in particular are especially oppressed.
That barren pasture, empty and salted. Right here.
Basically, their worth is tied to their ability to reproduce, and if they can't reproduce, they're either used for sexual gratification or, even worse, disposable. And man, if that isn't a great metaphor for how women have largely been treated in the world for the history of forever, I'm not sure what is. And of course, it turns out that the replicant Jesus, their savior and the sign of their liberation, isn't K, it's a woman, Dr. Anna Stelling. As film critic Priscilla Page said in her Birth Movies Death piece on 2049, this is a dystopian hell for women, but it foresees a future that belongs to them.
I will show her to the world, and she will lead our army.
She?
The third act reveal that K isn't the replicant child, that it's actually Dr. Anna, is an enormous narrative bait and switch. The revelation means that we're in a different movie than we thought we were in. In a meta sense, K learns that he isn't the main character of this story, much to his supreme existential disappointment. To again quote screenwriter Hampton Fancher, The idea behind K is that he's a handbook that becomes a poem. He begins the movie as this cog in the machine, and then he learns he may be more than a cog, that he may be so much more important than that, and then he learns that he isn't. But by that point, it doesn't matter. To again quote Priscilla Page, K realizes he's not a miracle, not special after all, but it no longer matters. The moment K thinks that he is more and wants to be more, he becomes more. His perception is reality. It reprograms him.
The real boy needs a real name. Joe.
Joe.
You're too important for Kay. Your mother would have named you.
Got a name?
Officer KD6-3.
That's not a name. It's a serial number.
All right. Joe.
Kay suddenly thinks that he's worthy of dignity and respect and love and a name because he was born. But then he realizes, God damn it, I deserve those things because I'm alive and I'm conscious and I feel. And that's enough. There's a lot of talk of real in this movie.
We're all just looking out for something real.
A real boy now. And if you have authentic memories, you have real human responses. I want to be real for you.
You are real for me. I know it's real.
Yes. Like a real girl.
Is it real?
I don't know. Ask him. I know what's real.
Kay at first thinks that being born makes him real, or more real than if he had been made.
To be born is to have a soul, I guess.
But it's not that black and white. The self-worth and actualization that he felt, that was real because he felt it. His love for Joy was real because he felt it. The love that Deckard felt for Rachel was real, and it can't be replicated just because Wallace builds another version of Rachel. Kay is desperate to track down Deckard because he believes that in him, he will find the love of a parent-child relationship, and he will feel wanted, and he will feel like a part of something. Kay is right about the relationship, but he's wrong about his place in it. And yet, he still makes the choice to be a part of the relationship, to be a part of that love. Even if he's literally on the outside looking into this relationship, he's still a part of it because it wouldn't have happened without him.
Dying for the right cause is the most human thing we can do.
Freysa says this line in reference to Deckard, when she tells Kay that he must kill Deckard to protect the replicant revolution. But Kay's a cultural middleman. He doesn't care about the revolution. He no longer cares about maintaining order and the wall separating kind. And he doesn't care about Wallace finding the key to replicant birth. Kay's choice is love. He dies so that a father and daughter can find each other. To him, that is the right cause. That is the most human thing he can do. Screenwriter Michael Green said that the whole movie was about a character's aspiration towards ascension. Kay aspires to be more than he is, and that aspiration in itself makes him more. And in choosing to be a part of something real and giving his life for it, he ascends.
Just a moment. Beautiful, isn't it?